Hey guys, tonight we begin with a true story that will haunt you. In 1140, a brilliant teacher named Peter Abelard was castrated by his student's uncle for daring to fall in love with her. What makes this even more shocking? She chose to love him for the rest of her life. What if I told you that medieval court records document hundreds of people who were executed simply for marrying someone their family disapproved of? And here's what will blow your mind. The most passionate love letters ever written in human history came from people who were forbidden to ever touch each other again. Before we dive into these incredible true stories, here's what would absolutely make my night. If this gives you chills, and I promise it will, hit that subscribe button and tap that like. But here's what I'm really curious about. What time is it where you are right now? Are you cozy in bed in California? Maybe it's morning coffee time in London. Drop your time zone in the comments because I love knowing we're sharing these stories together across the world. Now, let's dim those lights, get comfortable, and travel back to a time when falling in love could literally cost you everything. Picture this. You're living in the year 1200, and love isn't a choice. It's a crime. Not metaphorically, literally. In medieval Europe, choosing your heart over your family's wishes could get you disinherited, exiled, or worse. And the statistics from surviving court records absolutely mind-blowing. Historians who studied thousands of medieval documents found that unauthorized marriages had devastating consequences for most people involved. Here's what completely shocked me when I first learned this. Medieval people didn't just risk embarrassment for love. They risked everything, their families, their futures, sometimes their lives. And yet they did it anyway, again and again. Makes you wonder what kind of love could possibly be worth such incredible risk. Let me paint you a picture that will make your modern dating problems seem adorable. You're 14 years old, and yes, that was considered marriageable age, and your parents have just announced your engagement to someone you've never met. Maybe they're twice your age. Maybe they live hundreds of miles away. Maybe they don't even speak your language. But here's the part that would shock us today. Refusing wasn't really an option. This wasn't about compatibility or happiness. Marriage was business, pure and simple. The Catholic Church, which controlled virtually every aspect of daily life, had very specific ideas about love and marriage. They taught that marriage was primarily for creating alliances and producing legitimate heirs. St. Augustine, one of the church's most influential theologians, actually wrote that passionate love, even between married couples, could be spiritually dangerous because it distracted people from focusing on God. Think about it like this. Imagine if every romantic decision you made be approved by a board of directors who cared more about business partnerships than your emotional well-being. That was essentially medieval marriage. Your heart was considered a luxury that most people simply couldn't afford. But here's where human nature gets beautifully stubborn. The more something is forbidden, the more desperately people want it. Modern psychology calls this reactance theory. When we're told we can't have something, our desire for it actually intensifies. Medieval people didn't understand the science behind it, but they definitely felt the effects. The social class system made everything even more complicated. If you were a peasant, which about 90% of people were, and you fell in love with someone from the nobility, that wasn't just inappropriate social climbing. It was seen as an attack on the natural order that God himself had established. There are documented cases of severe punishments for people who dared to love above their station. Political marriages created their own special kind of heartbreak. Princesses and noble daughters were essentially bargaining chips used to secure treaties, prevent wars, or combine family lands. Ellen of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the medieval period, was married off as a teenager to secure political alliances. She later wrote about feeling like a piece in a chess game rather than a person with her own desires. Religious life presented another challenge entirely. Monks and nuns took vows of celibacy, promising to give up all romantic love in service to God. But monasteries and convents were often filled with the most educated, interesting people of their time. The records from various religious houses show that maintaining these vows wasn't always easy, and romantic relationships did develop, often leading to scandal and punishment. For people who were attracted to others of the same gender, the situation was even more dangerous. The church considered such relationships sinful, and civil law often prescribed severe punishments. Yet historians have found evidence of same-sex relationships that people maintained in secret, sometimes for years. Now here's the fascinating part. All these restrictions didn't kill romance. They transformed it into something almost mythical. When love becomes forbidden, it becomes legendary. Medieval people developed incredibly creative ways to express their feelings. They created secret codes, embedded hidden messages in poetry, and developed elaborate courtship rituals that could disguise true passion behind socially acceptable behavior. Some lovers communicated through symbolic flower arrangements, where different blooms carried specific meanings. Others used acrostic poems, where the first letter of each line spelled out their beloved's name. Some created entire business relationships just to have an excuse to correspond. It was like an underground language of love that existed alongside normal society. The irony is beautiful. A society that tried so hard to control love actually created some of the most passionate, enduring love stories in human history. These forbidden romances became the foundation for everything we consider romantic today. The idea of love conquering all, of passion being worth any sacrifice, of two hearts beating as one against impossible odds. Every romantic movie you've ever loved, every love song that's given you chills, every story about true love overcoming obstacles, they all trace back to these medieval rebels who looked at a world that said you cannot love and decided to love anyway. And that brings us to the most famous.
Be approved by a board of directors who cared more about business partnerships than your emotional well-being. That was essentially medieval marriage. Your heart was considered a luxury that most people simply couldn't afford. But here's where human nature gets beautifully stubborn. The more something is forbidden, the more desperately people want it. Modern psychology calls this reactance theory. When we're told we can't have something, our desire for it actually intensifies. Medieval people didn't understand the science behind it, but they definitely felt the effects. The social class system made everything even more complicated. If you were a peasant, which about 90% of people were, and you fell in love with someone from the nobility, that wasn't just inappropriate social climbing. It was seen as an attack on the natural order that God himself had established. There are documented cases of severe punishments for people who dared to love above their station. Political marriages created their own special kind of heartbreak. Princesses and noble daughters were essentially bargaining chips used to secure treaties, prevent wars, or combined family lands. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the medieval period, was married off as a teenager to secure political alliances. She later wrote about feeling like a piece in a chess game rather than a person with her own desires. Religious life presented another challenge entirely. Monks and nuns took vows of celibacy, promising to give up all romantic love in service to God. But monasteries and convents were often filled with the most educated, interesting people of their time. The records from various religious houses show that maintaining these vows wasn't always easy, and romantic relationships did develop, often leading to scandal and punishment. For people who were attracted to others of the same gender, the situation was even more dangerous. The church considered such relationships sinful, and civil law often prescribed severe punishments. Yet historians have found evidence of same-sex relationships that people maintained in secret, sometimes for years. Now here's the fascinating part. All these restrictions didn't kill romance. They transformed it into something almost mythical. When love becomes forbidden, it becomes legendary. Medieval people developed incredibly creative ways to express their feelings. They created secret codes, embedded hidden messages in poetry, and developed elaborate courtship rituals that could disguise true passion behind socially acceptable behavior. Some lovers communicated through symbolic flower arrangements, where different blooms carried specific meanings. Others used acrostic poems, where the first letter of each line spelled out their beloved's name. Some create entire fictional business relationships just to have an excuse to correspond. It was like an underground language of love that existed alongside society. The irony is beautiful. A society that tried so hard to control love actually created some of the most passionate, enduring love stories in human history. These forbidden romances became the foundation for everything we consider romantic today. The idea of love conquering all, of passion being worth any sacrifice, of two hearts beating as one against impossible odds. Every romantic movie you've ever loved, every love song that's given you chills, every story about true love overcoming obstacles, they all trace back to these medieval rebels who looked at a world that said you cannot love and decided to love anyway. And that brings us to the most famous,
most passionate, and most tragic of all these forbidden medieval love stories. It begins in the intellectual heart of Paris, where the most brilliant minds of the age gathered to study and debate. Notre Dame Cathedral was still under construction, and the city was buzzing with new ideas about philosophy, theology, and human nature. This is where Peter Abelard, considered one of the greatest teachers and philosophers of his time, was about to meet a student whose intelligence matched his own. Her name was Heloise. She was the niece of a powerful church official, and she was about to become part of a love story so intense, so scandalous, and so tragic that people are still talking about it nearly 900 years later. Their story has everything: brilliant minds falling in love, secret marriage, family betrayal, violent revenge, forced separation, and love letters so beautiful they're still studied today. But most shocking of all, what happened to Abelard was so brutal that it changed both their lives forever and somehow made their love even stronger. But that incredible story is where we begin next time, with two of the most brilliant people of their age discovering that sometimes the greatest minds create the most dangerous loves. So here we are, standing in the shadow of medieval Paris, where the air itself seemed to crackle with intellectual energy. The year is 1115, and if you walked through the narrow streets near Notre Dame, still just a construction site back then, you'd hear the most fascinating debates echoing from tiny rooms where the world's brightest minds gathered to argue about everything from the nature of God to the mysteries of human reason. In one of those rooms sat a man who was quite literally changing how people thought. Peter Abelard wasn't just any teacher. He was a rock star of medieval academia. Students traveled hundreds of miles just to hear him lecture. Kings sought his advice. The church both feared and revered his intellectual power. At 36, he was handsome, charismatic, and completely aware of his own brilliance. Some historians describe him as having what we'd now call a massive ego, but honestly, he had every right to it. Abelard had this incredible gift for taking the most complex philosophical questions and making them accessible. He questioned everything: church doctrine, ancient philosophers, even his own teachers. In a world where most people simply accepted what they were told, Abelard dared to ask, "But why?" And that single question was revolutionizing education across Europe. But here's where our story takes a turn that nobody, not even the brilliant Abelard, saw coming. Canon Fulbert, one of the most respected church officials in Paris, had a problem. His 17-year-old niece, Heloise, was too smart for her own good, and in medieval times, that was genuinely dangerous for a woman. She could read and write in Latin, French, and Hebrew, languages that most men couldn't master. She devoured philosophy texts, wrote poetry that made grown scholars weep, and had this annoying habit of asking questions that made church officials extremely uncomfortable. Fulbert needed someone brilliant enough to challenge her mind and respected enough that her unconventional education wouldn't cause scandal. Someone who could channel her dangerous intelligence into acceptable directions. And there was really only one man in all of Paris who fit that description: Peter Abelard. So Fulbert made Abelard an offer that seemed perfect for everyone involved. Come live in our house, teach Eloise privately, and in exchange, you'll pay no rent and have access to the finest private library in Paris. For a scholar like Abelard, this was essentially winning the medieval lottery. But here's what Fulbert didn't know, and what Abelard would later confess in his writings. The great philosopher had an ulterior motive. He'd heard about this extraordinary young woman, and he was curious. Not just intellectually curious, he was intrigued by the idea of a woman whose mind could match his own. Their first lesson took place on a crisp autumn morning in 1115. Abelard later wrote about this moment with a detail that still gives me chills. He described walking into Fulbert's library and seeing Heloise for the first time. Not her beauty, which contemporary accounts say was remarkable, but her eyes. He wrote that her eyes held a kind of intelligence that seemed to see straight through everything, including him. They began with Aristotle, moved to Augustine, debated the nature of universals and the problem of evil. But what started as intellectual discussion quickly became something much more dangerous. These weren't just teacher and student. These were two of the most brilliant minds of their generation, discovering that intellectual connection could be the most intoxicating form of attraction imaginable. Abelard later admitted that he began creating excuses to extend their lessons. Eloise, for her part, started asking increasingly complex questions that required longer explanations. Their philosophical debates became literary discussions, which became personal conversations, which became something that neither of them had expected or prepared for. The beauty of their relationship was that it began in their minds before it ever touched their hearts. In a world where most marriages were arranged without the couple ever having a meaningful conversation, here were two people who fell in love with each other's thoughts first. But they were playing an incredibly dangerous game, and they both knew it. Abelard was supposed to be Eloise's teacher and spiritual guide. She was the beloved niece of a powerful church official. He was a man who'd taken informal vows of celibacy to pursue his academic career. She was expected to either marry someone of her uncle's choosing or enter a convent. What happened next is documented in their own letters, which survived because they're considered some of the most beautiful love letters ever written in any language. As winter turned to spring in 1116, their intellectual attraction became emotional, then physical. Abelard wrote that their lessons increasingly became excuses to spend time together. Their debates became conversations about everything except what they were really feeling. And then came the moment that changed everything. During what was supposed to be a discussion on Plato's theory of love, and I swear I'm not making this irony up, Eloise looked at Abelard and asked a question that had nothing to do with philosophy and everything to do with the way he was looking at her. Abelard later wrote that in that moment, all his intellectual defenses crumbled. Here was someone who understood not just his ideas, but his soul. Someone who could challenge him, inspire him, and make him feel like his mind had finally found its perfect match. They became lovers in secret, meeting in that library, surrounded by centuries of wisdom about love, passion, and the human heart. But here's what makes their story even more remarkable. Their intellectual connection never diminished. Even as their relationship became physical, they continued to challenge each other's
ideas, to write poetry together, to debate philosophy with the same intensity they brought to everything else. For nearly a year, they managed to keep their relationship hidden. Abelard would arrive for lessons. Fulbert would greet him warmly and then leave them alone with their books and their dangerous secret. From the outside, everything looked perfectly appropriate. Just a brilliant teacher and his exceptional student exploring the great questions of existence. Secrets this powerful have a way of revealing themselves, and when this particular secret exploded into the open, it would destroy lives, end careers, and create one of history's most tragic love stories. The end began, as these things often do, with the most natural consequence in the world. In late 1117, Heloise realized she was pregnant. Just imagine the terror of that moment. Here's a young woman whose entire future depended on her reputation, carrying the child of a man who was supposed to be her spiritual mentor. Here's a scholar whose career would be destroyed if anyone discovered he had broken his informal vows of celibacy. And here's a powerful church official who would be utterly humiliated if this scandal became public. But what happened next reveals something beautiful about both Abelard and Eloise. Instead of panic, instead of trying to find some way to cover up their relationship, they made a choice that shows you exactly who they were. They chose love. They chose each other. They chose to face whatever consequences came from that choice. Abelard secretly married Heloise in a small ceremony outside Paris. It wasn't legal in the eyes of the church because he was supposed to be celibate, and it wasn't socially acceptable because she was supposed to marry someone of her uncle's choosing. But they spoke vows to each other anyway, making promises that they would keep for the rest of their lives. And that's where our story takes a turn towards something so brutal, so medieval, and so shocking that it changed both their lives forever. Because Uncle Fulbert had finally discovered what was happening in his own house, and his reaction was going to be swift, violent, and absolutely medieval in its cruelty. But the most amazing part, even after everything that was about to happen to them, even after the violence and the forced separation and the complete destruction of the life they'd planned together, their love story was just beginning. Because sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about people who get to be together. They're about people who choose to love each other anyway, no matter what the world does to try to stop them. What Fulbert did to Abelard on that terrible night in 1118 was going to test that love in ways that would have destroyed most people. But Heloise and Abelard weren't most people. They were about to prove that when two souls truly recognize each other, not even the most brutal medieval justice can tear them apart. The night that changed everything began like any other. It was a cold spring evening in 1118, and Abelard was asleep in his quarters near the cathedral school, probably dreaming about philosophy or his secret wife, completely unaware that Canon Fulbert had finally pieced together what was happening under his own roof. You have to understand, Fulbert wasn't just angry. He was absolutely humiliated. In medieval society, a man's honor was everything, and Abelard had made him look like a fool in front of all of Paris. The great church official who couldn't even protect his own niece's virtue. The respected canon who'd been so naive that he'd literally invited the wolf into his house and paid him to be there. What happened next reveals something terrifying about medieval justice. Fulbert didn't just want revenge. He wanted to make an example that would echo through history. He wanted to make sure that no man would ever dare to dishonor a family again. Hooray! So Fulbert did something that was both legal and absolutely horrifying. He hired a group of men to break into Abelard's room in the middle of the night. What they did to him was called just punishment under medieval law, but by today's standards, it would be considered one of the most brutal acts of revenge imaginable. They castrated him. Let me pause for a moment because I know that's a shocking thing to hear, even 900 years later. But this wasn't random violence. This was calculated medieval justice. By removing Abelard's manhood, Fulbert was making a statement that would be understood by everyone in their society. The punishment matched the crime. The man who had used his masculine power to seduce an innocent girl would no longer have that power. Abelard survived, but barely. Medieval surgery was basically guesswork, and the fact that he lived through this brutal assault was considered miraculous. But surviving was only the beginning of his ordeal. Because in medieval society, a castrated man wasn't just physically diminished, he was socially destroyed. Think about it. Abelard had built his entire identity around his intellectual brilliance and his masculine charisma. He was the teacher that students traveled hundreds of miles to hear, the philosopher who could debate anyone and win, the man who'd seduced the most intelligent woman in Paris. Suddenly, he was none of those things. He was damaged goods in a society that had no place for damaged men. The news spread through Paris like wildfire. Within days, everyone knew what had happened to the great Peter Abelard. Some people whispered that it was divine justice for breaking his vows. Others said it was a tragedy that such a brilliant mind had been destroyed by one moment of weakness. But everyone agreed on one thing. His career was over. Here's what breaks my heart about this story. Abelard's first concern wasn't for himself, it was for Heloise. In the letters he wrote later, he described lying in that bed, broken and bleeding, worrying not about his own future, but what this scandal would do to the woman he loved. because while he would recover and eventually rebuild some kind of life, her reputation was destroyed forever. In medieval society, a woman involved in a scandal like this had essentially no options. She couldn't marry anyone respectable because everyone knew she'd been ruined. She couldn't return to normal society because the shame would follow her everywhere. Her only choice was to disappear behind convent walls and spend the rest of her life in religious penance. But here's where Heloise showed the strength that would make her legendary. When Abelard sent word that she should enter a convent to protect what was left
Of her reputation, her response was extraordinary. She wrote back, and these are her actual words that survived in the monastery archives: "I would rather be your whore than another man's wife." Can you imagine the courage it took to write those words in 1118? In a society where women were supposed to be silent, submissive, and ashamed of their sexuality, Eloise essentially said, "I regret nothing. I chose love, and I would choose it again." But she also understood the reality of their situation. Their secret marriage meant nothing now. No one would recognize it, and Abelard's condition made it impossible anyway. Their son, who they'd named Astrolabe after a scientific instrument because they were nerds, even in their choice of baby names, would have to be raised by Abelard's family in secret. So Eloise made the most heartbreaking decision imaginable. She agreed to take vows as a nun, not because she felt called to religious life, but because it was the only way to protect the man she loved from further scandal. She would sacrifice her freedom, her future, and any chance of happiness to save what was left of Abelard's reputation. The day she took her vows at the convent of Argenteuil was one of the most dramatic scenes in medieval history. According to witnesses, Eloise stood before the altar and recited the traditional vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But as she spoke the words that would bind her to religious life forever, tears streamed down her face. Not tears of religious joy, but tears of grief for the life she was giving up. Abelard, meanwhile, made his own dramatic choice. Unable to continue as a secular teacher after the scandal, he became a monk at the Abbey of Saint-Denis. But his letters reveal that he didn't choose religious life out of calling, he chose it out of shame and desperation. He wrote that he felt like a dead man walking, going through the motions of monastic life while his heart remained with the woman he could never see again. And that's where most tragic love stories would end, with the lovers separated forever, their dreams destroyed, their future stolen by the cruelty of the world around them. But Heloise and Abelard's story was just beginning a new chapter, one that would prove their love was stronger than physical separation, more enduring than social scandal, and more passionate than most people who get to spend their whole lives together. Because here's what their enemies didn't understand. When you take two brilliant minds that have recognized each other as soulmates and force them apart, you don't kill their love. You transform it into something almost supernatural. They began writing letters. Not just any letters, but correspondence so beautiful, so intellectually rich, and so emotionally honest that they're still studied in universities today as the pinnacle of medieval literature. These weren't just love letters. They were philosophical treatises, theological debates, and emotional confessions all rolled into one. Heloise wrote to Abelard about her struggles with religious life, admitting that she performed her duties as a nun while her heart remained completely secular. She questioned church doctrine, challenged religious authority, and described her ongoing passion for a man she was supposed to have forgotten. Her letters reveal a woman of extraordinary honesty and intellectual courage. Abelard responded with equal emotional intensity, but also with the guilt and self-recrimination that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He blamed himself not just for what had happened to him, but for what had happened to her. He wrote that he would gladly suffer his punishment again if it meant she could have had a different life. But here's the most remarkable thing about their correspondence. It wasn't just about looking backward at what they'd lost. They continued to challenge each other intellectually, to debate theology and philosophy, to grow and learn together despite being physically apart. The love had evolved beyond the physical into something that distance couldn't touch. The letters were copied and shared throughout medieval Europe, becoming legendary even during their lifetimes. Other lovers read them for inspiration. Scholars studied them for their theological insights.
Even church officials who officially disapproved of their relationship secretly admired the beauty of their writing. And that brings us to someone who would challenge everything we think we know about medieval love, power, and the choices women could make in a world designed to control them. Because while Heloise and Abelard were writing their hearts out from behind monastery walls, there was another woman who was rewriting the rules entirely. Her name was Eleanor of Aquitaine, and she was about to prove that sometimes the most powerful love story is the one where a woman refuses to let anyone else choose her destiny. Now, imagine being the most powerful woman in Europe before you turn 25. That was Eleanor of Aquitaine's reality. And trust me, she made the most of it in ways that scandalized the entire medieval world. Born in 1122, Eleanor inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine when she was just 15 years old, making her the wealthiest unmarried woman in Europe virtually overnight. We're talking about lands that stretch from the Lyre River to the Pyrenees, basically a third of modern-day France. In today's terms, she was like a teenage billionaire with her own army. And everyone, absolutely everyone, wanted to marry her. But here's what makes Eleanor's story so fascinating. She didn't just accept being treated like a prize to be won. From the very beginning, she made it clear that she intended to have a say in her own life, her own marriages, and yes, her own love affairs. And in a world where women were supposed to be seen and not heard, Eleanor's voice was about to echo through history soon. Her first marriage was arranged before she could object. At 15, she was married to Louis XI of France, making her Queen of France while she was still practically a child. Now, Louis was a decent enough guy, devout, well-meaning, and completely overwhelmed by having a wife who had strong opinions about everything, from military strategy to church reform. Contemporary chronicles describe Louis as the kind of man who would have been perfectly happy as a monk. He was deeply religious, preferred prayer to politics, and had no idea what to do with a wife who had strong opinions about everything from military strategy to challenging papal authority at dinner parties. It's almost comical how unmatched they were, like pairing a racehorse with a meditation teacher. But the real problem wasn't personality differences. The real problem was that after 15 years of marriage, Eleanor had given Louis only 2 daughters, no male heir. And in medieval politics, that was a catastrophe. The French court began whispering that maybe God was displeased with their union. Maybe the marriage was cursed. Maybe it was time for Louis to find a new wife who could give him sons. Eleanor, being Eleanor, had a different interpretation. She decided that the problem wasn't divine displeasure. The problem was that she had married the wrong man. And in 1152, she did something that shocked the entire medieval world. She divorced the King of France. Now, divorce in the 12th century wasn't like divorce today. You couldn't just file papers and split your assets. You had to prove that your marriage had never been valid in the first place, usually by claiming some distant blood relation that violated canon law. Eleanor managed to get her marriage annulled on the grounds that she and Louis were related within the prohibited degree. Basically, they were distant cousins, which was technically against canon law, but had been conveniently overlooked when the marriage was politically useful. But here's the part that made everyone's jaw drop. Eleanor negotiated to keep all her lands, all of them. She walked away from her marriage to the King of France with her wealth, her titles, and her independence intact. In a world where divorced women usually ended up in convents with nothing, Eleanor essentially pulled off the greatest prenup in medieval history.
And then just 8 weeks after her divorce was finalized, she did something that sent shockwaves through every royal court in Europe. She married Henry Plantagenet, who was 11 years younger than her, dashingly handsome, and about to become King Henry II of England. The speed of this marriage was scandalous enough, but the choice of husband was pure genius. Henry wasn't just young and attractive. He was ambitious, intelligent, and powerful enough to protect Eleanor's independence while being secure enough not to be threatened by her strength. Plus, and this is where it gets deliciously complicated, marrying Henry meant that Eleanor's vast French territories would now belong to the English crown, making her ex-husband Louis's life extremely difficult. Medieval chroniclers had no idea what to make of Eleanor and Henry's relationship. Some called it a political alliance disguised as romance. Others whispered that it was pure physical attraction between two of the most charismatic people of their age. But Eleanor's own letters, the few that survived, suggest something even more interesting. she'd found her intellectual and emotional equal. Henry II was known for his explosive temper, his boundless energy, and his habit of wearing out multiple horses in a single day because he couldn't sit still. Eleanor matched him in every way. Where Louis had been overwhelmed by her personality, Henry was energized by it. They debated politics, planned military campaigns together, and created what was essentially a medieval power couple. Their marriage produced 8 children, including the future King Richard the Lionheart and King John of Magna Carta fame. But more importantly, it created a partnership that redefined what was possible for women in positions of power. Eleanor didn't just marry Henry. She actively ruled alongside him, making decisions about everything from legal reform to international diplomacy. But here's where Eleanor's story gets even more remarkable. In 1173, when she was 51 years old and had been married to Henry for 21 years, she did something that would have been unthinkable for any other medieval woman. She led a revolt against her own husband. Henry had been having very public affairs, including one with a woman named Rosamund Clifford, who'd installed in a palace and showered with gifts that should have gone to his queen. Eleanor had tolerated his infidelities for years, but when Henry began making decisions about their son's inheritance without consulting her, she'd had enough. So Eleanor organized her sons into a rebellion against their father. She personally traveled through Aquitaine, raising armies and securing alliances. Contemporary accounts describe her riding at the head of troops, wearing armor and giving speeches that inspired fierce loyalty. At 51, she was literally leading a medieval feminist revolution disguised as a family feud. The rebellion failed, and Henry had Eleanor in prison for the next 16 years. But even in captivity, she remained a force to be reckoned with. She continued to influence politics through secret correspondence, maintained loyalty among her supporters, and waited for her chance to reclaim her power. When Henry died in 1189, Eleanor was released by her son Richard, who immediately recognized that he needed his mother's political expertise. At 67, an age when most medieval women were considered ancient, Eleanor embarked on the most adventurous period of her life. She traveled across Europe, arranging marriages, negotiating treaties, and at one point personally journeyed to Sicily to escort her granddaughter to Spain for a royal wedding. But perhaps the most telling story about Eleanor comes from the very end of her life. When she was nearly 80 years old, she learned that her grandson, Prince Arthur, was being threatened by King John. Despite her advanced age, Eleanor personally led a military campaign to protect the boy, besieging a castle and negotiating his release through sheer force of personality. Eleanor's approach to love was revolutionary because she insisted on being an equal partner in all her relationships. She refused to be a passive recipient of male protection or decision-making. She loved passionately, but on her own terms. And when love disappointed her, she didn't retreat into wounded silence. She took action to change her circumstances. What makes Eleanor's story so modern is that she understood something that many people today are still learning. Love and power don't have to be mutually exclusive. You can be passionate and political, romantic and strategic, vulnerable and strong. Eleanor loved deeply, but she never let love diminish her sense of self-worth or personal agency. And speaking of revolutionary approaches to love, Eleanor's court in Aquitaine became the birthplace of something that would change romantic culture forever, the tradition of courtly love. But what most people don't know about courtly love is that it was essentially an elaborate game where knights would fall in love with married women they could never have, creating some of the most passionate and impossible relationships in medieval history. Darrow, welcome to the most bizarre dating system ever invented by human beings. Seriously, if you think modern relationships are complicated, wait until you hear about courtly love, a medieval tradition so strange, so elaborate, and completely backwards that it makes reality TV look straightforward. Eleanor's court at Poitiers in the 1170s was like a medieval think tank for romance, where the most creative minds of the age gathered to essentially ask, what if we made love as complicated and impossible as humanly imaginable? And the answer they came up with was courtly love, a system where the whole point was to fall desperately in love with someone you could never, ever have. Here's how it worked, and I promise you, you're going to think I'm making this up. A knight would choose a married noblewoman, usually someone significantly above his social station, and declare himself her devoted servant. Not her lover, mind you, her servant. He would then spend years, sometimes decades, performing elaborate acts of devotion to prove his worth, knowing full well that his love would never be consummated. The rules were incredibly specific, almost like a medieval dating app with the world's most frustrating terms of service. The Andreas Capellanus, who wrote The Art of Courtly Love around 1184, laid out 31 official rules that included gems like, marriage is no real excuse for not loving, no one can be bound by a double love, and my personal favorite, a true lover is constantly and without intermission possessed by his beloved. Think about that for a moment. They created a system where being miserable was the whole point, where unrequited love wasn't a bug, it was a feature, where the greatest romantic achievement was to love someone so purely that you never even tried to win them. But here's what makes courtly love fascinating, rather than just masochistic. It was actually a form of emotional and intellectual rebellion disguised as entertainment. In a world where marriages were business arrangements and women had no choice in their romantic destinies, courtly love created a space where emotions could be explored, where women could hold power over men, and where love could exist purely for its own sake. Let me tell you about Crétin Troy, one of the most famous courtly love poets who wrote for Eleanor's court. His stories about knights like Lancelot weren't just entertainment, they were revolutionary propaganda. In his tales, the greatest knights in the world would abandon honor, duty, and common sense for love. Lancelot literally walked across a sword bridge to reach Guinevere, choosing love over his own safety. In a society that valued masculine strength and military prowess, but above all else, these stories suggested that emotional vulnerability might actually be the highest form of courage. The women in these relationships held unprecedented power. A knight's lady could demand anything of him, that he fight in tournaments wearing her colors, that he write her poetry, that he undertake dangerous quests just to prove his devotion. Mahat Champagne, Eleanor's daughter, reportedly held courts of love where noble women would hear cases about romantic disputes and render judgments about proper courtly behavior. But here's where it gets really interesting. Some of these relationships, despite all the rules about impossibility and purity, became genuinely passionate affairs that lasted for decades. Take the case of Ulrich von Liechtenstein, a German knight who fell in love with a married noblewoman and spent 30 years writing songs about her, fighting in tournaments for her honor, and performing increasingly elaborate stunts to win her attention. Von Liechtenstein's autobiography, written in the 1250s, reads like a medieval romantic comedy. He once disguised himself as the goddess Venus and traveled across Europe challenging other knights to joust in her honor. He cut off his own finger,
Sent it to his lady in a jeweled box as a Valentine's gift, which she apparently returned with a note saying she wasn't impressed. He learned to play musical instruments, write poetry in 3 languages, and even underwent what was essentially medieval plastic surgery to make his hair lip less noticeable, all in the hopes of winning her approval. The most remarkable part? She never left her husband for him. They never ran away together. They maintained their impossible relationship for 3 decades, with Ulrich perpetually hoping and his lady perpetually maintaining just enough distance to keep him devoted. And both of them seemed to find this arrangement not just tolerable, but deeply meaningful. Modern psychologists studying courtly love relationships have identified something fascinating. Many of these partnerships provided emotional intimacy that was completely absent from most medieval marriages. While married couples often barely knew each other and certainly didn't share their deepest thoughts, courtly lovers engaged in profound emotional and intellectual connections. They shared poetry, discussed philosophy, and created bonds that were often deeper than many legal marriages. But the most famous courtly love affair in history had to be the relationship between Dante Alighieri and Beatrice Portinari. Dante first saw Beatrice when they were both 9 years old, fell instantly in love, and spent the rest of his life writing about her. He spoke to her exactly twice in his entire life, literally 2 conversations, and yet she became the inspiration for the Divine Comedy, one of the greatest works of literature ever written. Beatrice married someone else, had children, and died young, never known that a man she'd barely spoken to was creating immortal art in her honor. Dante married someone else too, but continued to write about Beatrice as his spiritual guide and perfect love.
Their relationship existed almost entirely in his imagination, yet it produced poetry that people still read with tears in their eyes 700 years later. The courtly love tradition also created some of the most beautiful and bizarre romantic customs in history. Knights would wear tokens from their ladies, a scarf, a glove, sometimes even underwear into battle as symbols of their devotion. They would fast on holy days dedicated to their beloved. Some would take vows to perform a certain number of good deeds or charitable acts in their lady's honor. There are records of knights who built elaborate gardens and commissioned artwork dedicated to women who barely acknowledged their existence. One German nobleman spent a fortune creating a mechanical clock that played a different love song every hour, all composed for a woman who was married to his political rival. But perhaps the strangest aspect of courtly love was how it influenced actual marriages. Eleanor's own granddaughter, Blanche of Castile, used courtly love traditions to completely redefine her relationship with her husband, Louis VI of France. Instead of accepting the typical distant, formal royal marriage, she insisted that Louis courted her as if she were an unattainable lady. They wrote each other love poetry, exchanged romantic gifts, and maintained the rituals of courtly love even after 20 years of marriage and 8 children. The tradition spread throughout Europe, creating a culture where romantic expression became an art form. Courts competed to host the most elaborate romantic festivals. Nobles commissioned love songs like we might commission wedding photographers. The entire concept of romantic chivalry, opening doors, sending flowers, writing love letters, traces back to these medieval attempts to make love both impossible and eternal. And that brings us to perhaps the most heartbreaking example of courtly love put into practice, the real-life Romeo and Juliet stories that inspired Shakespeare centuries later. Because while courtly love was supposed to remain purely theoretical, some people took it to its logical conclusion, choosing death over life without their impossible beloved. These weren't fictional tragedies, they were real people who loved so completely that they made the ultimate sacrifice, creating stories so powerful that we're still telling them today. There's something you need to know about Romeo and Juliet. Shakespeare didn't invent that story. He borrowed it from real medieval lovers whose tragedies were so devastating, so emotionally powerful, that people had been retelling them for centuries before the bard ever put quill to paper. The most haunting of these true stories comes from 13th century Verona. Yes, the same Verona where Shakespeare would eventually set his play. But this wasn't fiction. This was the documented tragedy of Marot and Giannozza, whose love affair was recorded in the chronicles of Fragado Buggieri in 1281, nearly 300 years before Shakespeare was ever born. Marot was a young nobleman from a prominent Veronese family, and Giannozza was the daughter of his family's bitter political rivals. Sound familiar? In medieval Italian city-states, family feuds weren't just personal drama, they were literally matters of life and death. The Guelphs and Ghiblings had divided Italy into warring factions, and choosing the wrong side could get your entire family exiled or executed. But here's what makes their story even more tragic than Shakespeare's version. Marot and Giannozza actually managed to secretly marry. They found a sympathetic friar who performed the ceremony in a hidden chapel outside the city walls. For 3 months, they maintained their impossible love affair, meeting in secret, sharing stolen moments, and believing they could somehow make their love work despite the hatred between their families. Then, Marot killed Giannozza's cousin in a street fight. It wasn't planned, it wasn't premeditated, it was just the kind of sudden violence that erupted constantly between feuding families. But the result was catastrophic. Marot was banished from Verona immediately, and Giannozza's family, not knowing about the secret marriage, announced her engagement to a wealthy merchant from Florence. What happened next reads like the most heartbreaking love letter ever written. Giannozza sent a message to Marot through the same friar who had married them, begging him to return for her. She wrote, and these words survive in the monastery records, "I would rather die as your wife than live as another man's bride. If you love me as you have sworn, you will find a way to save me from this fate worse than death." Marot's response was immediate and desperate. He began the dangerous journey back to Verona, knowing that if he was caught within the city walls, he would be executed on sight. But love made him willing to risk everything. He disguised himself as a pilgrim, traveled mostly at night, and managed to reach the outskirts of Verona just as Gionitz's wedding preparations were beginning. But here's where their story takes a turn that's somehow even more tragic than Romeo and Juliet. Gionitza had convinced the same friar to give her a sleeping potion that would make her appear dead, allowing her to escape the arranged marriage and flee with Moderate. The plan was simple: fake her death, have Moderate rescue her from the tomb, and escape together to start a new life somewhere far from their feuding families. The plan worked perfectly. Gionitzou appeared to die suddenly, and her family, grief-stricken, prepared for her burial. But the message telling Moderate that her death was fake never reached him. A messenger was intercepted by rival family guards, and Moderate learned of Gionitz's death from a stranger who had no idea about their secret plan. What Moderate did next shows you the kind of love that medieval people were capable of. Instead of fleeing to safety, instead of accepting that fate had defeated them, he broke into the family tomb where Gionitzou was laid out in her wedding dress, apparently dead. The records from the City Watch describe finding Moderate's body the next morning slumped over Gionitz's tomb, an empty vial of poison in his hand. He had chosen to die rather than live without her. But the most heartbreaking detail: Gionitz's body was found beside his, and she'd clearly awakened from the sleeping potion. The evidence suggested that she had woken up, found Moderate dead beside her, and taken the same poison that had killed him. They died within hours of each other, victims of a communication failure that would have been tragic in any century, but was absolutely devastating in an age before reliable messaging systems. But their story doesn't end with their deaths. The discovery of their bodies, along with the love letters found in Moderate's possession, revealed their secret marriage to both families. The shock of realizing that their children had died for love and that their family feud had destroyed two innocent lives led to something unprecedented: the first recorded peace treaty between feuding Italian noble families. The Bultadi Chronicle records that both families, overwhelmed by grief and guilt, agreed to end their generations-long conflict. They established a joint charitable foundation in Moderate and Gionitz's memory, and their story became a cautionary tale that spread throughout northern Italy about the cost of family hatred. But they weren't the only real-life Romeo and Juliet. The medieval period is filled with documented cases of young lovers who chose death over separation. In 1200s France, there was the tragedy of Pierre de Lusignan and Melisande de Tripoli, two young nobles whose families were on opposite sides of a crusader political dispute. When their secret marriage was discovered, Pierre was sent on a dangerous mission to the Holy Land that everyone knew was essentially a death sentence. Melisande died of grief within weeks of his departure, and Pierre, learning of her death, deliberately sought death in battle against overwhelming odds. In England, there's the documented case of William de Braos and Maud de Clare, whose families were feuding over land rights. When their secret relationship was discovered, William was imprisoned in the Tower of London and Maud was forced into a convent. But Maud refused to take final vows, insisting that she was already married in the eyes of God. When William died in prison after 3 years, Maud starved herself to death rather than accept religious vows that would have meant abandoning her love for him. These stories spread through medieval Europe like wildfire, copied by scribes, retold by traveling minstrels, and adapted into different languages and cultures. The theme was always the same: young love destroyed by family hatred, with lovers choosing death over surrender.